Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness lead to the biggest surprises. A young girl on a delayed flight offers her seat to an elderly black veteran, thinking she's just helping him find comfort. But what happens next, a connection she could have never imagined, will change her life forever. By the end of the flight, both she and her mother are left speechless by the true identity of the man and the story he has to share. Before we jump into today's story, tell us where you're watching from, and if you enjoy it, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Emma sat with her mother and Sarah in the bustling airport terminal, clutching her small, stuffed bear. At 8 years old, she was excited but nervous. This was her first flight without her dad. They were heading to visit her grandparents, and Emma couldn't wait to get on the plane. However, the delay was making everyone restless. "Mommy, how much longer?" Emma asked, her eyes darting between the large windows overlooking the runway in the ticketing desk, hoping for news. "Not too much longer, sweetie," Sarah replied, giving her daughter a warm smile while glancing at her phone, trying to keep her own frustration in check. The overhead speakers finally crackled, announcing their flight was ready for boarding. Emma's eyes brightened as Sarah gathered their belongings. They walked to the boarding gate, and soon, they were on the plane, moving through the narrow aisle to their seats. As they approached their row, Emma noticed an elderly black man a few steps behind them, walking slowly with a noticeable limp. His hands clutched a heavy-looking carry-on bag, and though his face was calm, it was clear that every step took effort. Emma watched, her eyes wide with curiosity, as the man struggled to lift his bag into the overhead compartment. His hands shook slightly, and after a few tries, the bag slipped from his grasp, hitting the edge of the seat. Nearby, a tall man in a crisp, expensive suit snapped his head up, glaring at the elderly man. "Watch it!" he barked. "Do you even know what you're doing?" The old man mumbled an apology, looking flustered as he tried to secure the bag again. The wealthy man, unimpressed, shook his head. "Some people don't know when they're in over their heads," he muttered, loud enough for everyone around to hear. Sarah felt her stomach twist with anger at the man's words. Emma, still holding her stuffed bear, glanced up at her mother, her face full of confusion. "Why is he being mean, Mommy?" Sarah gave a tight-lipped smile, her voice soft. "Sometimes people aren't kind when they should be, but we can be better." The tension hung in the air as the elderly man finally managed to stow his bag, his face flushed with embarrassment. Sarah watched, her heart aching for him. She could feel the discomfort of the other passengers, but no one said a word. As the flight attendants moved down the aisle, making sure passengers were seated, Sarah turned her attention back to Emma. But the image of the elderly man and the wealthy passenger's cruel words lingered in her mind. Little did she know this encounter was just the beginning of a journey that would reveal an extraordinary story, one that would change their lives forever. As the plane's engines roared to life, Emma leaned back in her seat, her small hands gripping her stuffed bear tightly. She glanced at the man in the expensive suit who had snapped at the elderly man earlier. His eyes were glued to his phone, completely indifferent to the world around him. Emma couldn't shake the unease she felt from witnessing the interaction. Sarah noticed her daughter's distraction and gave her a reassuring smile, brushing her hand over Emma's curls. "It's going to be fine, sweetie," she said softly. "Let's just focus on having a good trip to Grandma and Grandpa's, okay?" Emma nodded, but she was still preoccupied with the elderly man. She couldn't help but peek through the narrow gap between the seats, watching as he settled into his spot near the back of the plane. His shoulders slumped slightly as if the weight of the world rested on them. Emma felt an overwhelming sense that he needed help, but she didn't know how. The seatbelt sign dinged off, and the flight attendants began moving down the aisle, preparing to serve drinks and snacks. Sarah busied herself with her tablet, but Emma's attention remained on the old man, who seemed to struggle even with something as simple as shifting in his seat. Finally, unable to keep her thoughts to herself, Emma whispered, "Mommy, should we help him?" Sarah paused, taken aback by Emma's question. "Help who, sweetie?" she asked. "The man," Emma said, nodding towards the back. "He's alone, and I think he's hurt." Sarah turned and glanced over her shoulder, her heart softening as she saw the elderly man again. Emma wasn't wrong. There was a heaviness in his demeanor, and now that Sarah was really paying attention, she could see that he was wincing slightly with every movement, probably from his leg injury. Before Sarah could respond, the man in the expensive suit in front of them rang for the flight attendant, his voice loud enough to cut through the quiet cabin. "Excuse me, can I move seats?" he asked. "I can't sit near that man. He smells awful. It's disgusting." The flight attendant approached, her expression polite but firm. "I'm sorry, sir. We are fully booked today. You'll have to stay in your assigned seat." The wealthy man scoffed, shaking his head in disbelief. "This is ridiculous. I'm not paying this kind of money to sit next to someone who smells like a hospital ward. Sarah could feel the tension rising again. She shot a look at Emma, who was staring wide-eyed at the unfolding scene. Taking a deep breath, Sarah leaned forward in her seat. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice firm but measured. "That man you're complaining about is a human being. Show some respect." The wealthy man whipped his head around, his face flushed with irritation. "This has nothing to do with you," he said sharply. Sarah met his gaze without flinching. "It has everything to do with me when someone is being mistreated." The flight attendant stood between them, her voice calm but authoritative. "Sir, ma'am, please, let's all be respectful of each other. We want to ensure everyone has a comfortable flight." Sarah nodded, but the wealthy man turned back around, his mood still sour. Emma looked up at her mother, eye meet to her eyes. "Mommy, you helped him," she whispered. Sarah squeezed Emma's hand gently. "Sometimes it's important to stand up for what's right," she said softly. But she could still feel the tension simmering in the air, and a part of her knew that the situation was far from over. As the flight continued, Sarah glanced back at the elderly man once more. His eyes were closed now, but there was a deep sense of weariness in his expression. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to his story, something important that she and Emma would soon discover. As the flight attendants continued serving drinks and snacks, the air in the cabin seemed to relax, though Sarah could still feel the unease lingering. Emma, however, had fallen into a peaceful quiet, resting her head against the window, her little fingers still gripping her stuffed bear. Sarah let out a slow breath, hoping that the rest of the flight would pass without any further incidents. But her thoughts kept drifting back to the elderly man. Every time she glanced his way, she noticed how he winced with each slight movement. It was clear that his leg was causing him pain, and Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that he deserved better than what he had just endured. Emma, who had been quietly watching the clouds outside, turned back to her mother. "Mommy," she whispered, "why did that man have to sit at the back? Why didn't someone help him?" Sarah didn't have an immediate answer. It bothered her too, the fact that no one, not even the flight attendants, had stepped in to offer assistance earlier. She could see the old man's discomfort and how he seemed to be bearing the weight of it in silence. "I don't know, sweetie," Sarah replied softly, "but maybe we can do something to help." Before Emma could ask what her mother meant, Sarah unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up. She moved quickly down the narrow aisle, her heart racing. She approached the elderly man's row, her voice gentle but firm as she spoke. "Sir, I couldn't help but notice you might be in some pain," Sarah said, offering him a kind smile. "My daughter and I would be happy to switch seats with you if that would make you more comfortable." The elderly man blinked, clearly surprised by the offer. His expression was a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. "You don't have to do that," he said, his voice soft and gravelly. "I'll manage." But Sarah could see the pain etched on his face, the struggle in his movements. "Please," she insisted. "It's no trouble. We'd really like to help." The man hesitated for a moment, but eventually he nodded, his eyes shining with appreciation. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "That's very kind of you." Sarah smiled warmly and turned back toward her seat, where Emma was watching with wide, curious eyes. "Come on, Emma," she said gently. "We're going to give this man our seats so he can be more comfortable." Emma, without hesitation, nodded and gathered her things. As they moved to the back of the plane, Sarah helped the elderly man carefully switch places with them. It took a bit of effort, but with Sarah's assistance, he settled into the seats that she and Emma had just vacated. Once they were all settled again, Sarah noticed a small smile on the man's face as he adjusted himself in his new, more comfortable seat. Emma looked up at him, her curiosity piqued. "Are you feeling better now?" she asked, her voice soft and kind. The elderly man nodded slowly, his eyes brimming with gratitude. "Much better," he replied, his voice warm. "Thank you, young lady. You've both been very kind." Emma beamed at him, proud of her small act of kindness, though she didn't fully understand the weight of what they had just done. But it wasn't just about giving up their seats. As Sarah glanced back at the elderly man, she had the distinct feeling that there was something more to his story, something deeper that they were about to uncover. As Sarah and Emma settled into their new seats near the back of the plane, the quiet hum of the cabin seemed to lull everyone into a calm. The wealthy passenger, who had caused such a scene earlier, glanced back at them once but said nothing. Sarah didn't care. She had done the right thing, and that's all that mattered. The elderly man, now seated comfortably where they had once been, seemed to relax for the first time during the flight. His shoulders eased, and the pain on his face lessened. Sarah felt a sense of peace wash over her. She hadn't expected this flight to turn into such an emotional journey, but here they were. "Mommy, who is that man?" Emma asked, her voice filled with childlike curiosity. "Why did he need our seats?" Sarah smiled softly at her daughter, brushing a hand over her hair. I don't know, sweetie, but I think we'll find out soon enough. As if on cue, the elderly man caught Sarah's eye from across the aisle and nodded in gratitude. Then, after a moment of hesitation, he stood slowly and made his way toward them. Despite his limp, he moved with dignity, and Sarah could see the strength in him, even in his frailness. May I sit for a moment? He asked, his voice kind but cautious. Of course, Sarah replied, gesturing to the seat beside her. Emma scooted closer to her mother, eager to hear what the man had to say. The man lowered himself into the seat with a slight grunt, his hands resting on his knees as he caught his breath. I just wanted to thank you both, he said after a moment. It's not often that people go out of their way to be kind these days. What you did means a lot to me. Sarah shook her head, her expression soft. It was no trouble at all, she said. We just wanted to make sure you were comfortable. The man smiled, his eyes twinkling with warmth. I appreciate it nonetheless. You know, he began, his voice growing more reflective. I've traveled a lot in my life, seen a lot of things, good and bad, but it's moments like this, moments of kindness that remind me of the good in people. Emma, her wide eyes fixed on the man, couldn't help but ask, What places have you been to? The man chuckled softly, glancing at Emma with amusement. Oh, I've been all over the world, young lady. Europe, Asia, the Pacific Islands, places you've probably only read about in books. Emma's eyes lit up. Wow, were you on vacation? The man's smile faltered slightly, though it remained warm. Not exactly, he said. I was a soldier many years ago. My travels were a bit more serious than vacations. Sarah's heart skipped a beat as she processed what the man had just said. A soldier. It explained a lot. The limp, the way he carried himself, the quiet strength behind his soft-spoken demeanor. There was so much more to him than met the eye. You're a veteran? Sarah asked, her voice filled with a mix of surprise and admiration. The man nodded slowly. Yes, ma'am, I served in World War II and the Korean War. It feels like a lifetime ago now, but those memories never really leave you. Sarah felt a wave of respect wash over her. She had always held veterans in high regard, knowing the sacrifices they had made for their country. But something about this man, his humility, his quiet suffering, touched her deeply. Thank you for your service, Sarah said, her voice soft but sincere. The man smiled, but there was a sadness in his eyes. It was my duty, he replied. But war leaves its marks, both on the battlefield and on the men who survive it. As the conversation continued, Sarah felt an unspoken bond forming between them. This was no ordinary man. He had lived through history, experienced the best and worst of humanity, and now he was sitting here with them, sharing pieces of his life. Little did she know there was still so much more to his story, a story that would soon take an unexpected and life-changing turn. The plane hummed steadily as the conversation deepened between Sarah, Emma, and the elderly veteran. His name, they learned, was Mr. James Thompson. Emma was captivated by his stories of traveling to distant lands, but Sarah could see the weight that lingered behind his words. His smile was gentle, but there was a pain in his eyes that spoke of battles fought not only in war but in life itself. I bet you've seen some pretty amazing things, Mr. Thompson, Emma said, her eyes wide with wonder. Mr. Thompson chuckled softly. I've seen more than I can count, young lady, but not all of it was amazing. Some of it was very hard. Emma tilted her head, curious but uncertain. Like what? Sarah placed a gentle hand on her daughter's shoulder, sensing the seriousness in Mr. Thompson's tone. War is difficult to talk about sometimes, Emma, she said softly. But Mr. Thompson was very brave. Mr. Thompson nodded, his eyes clouding for a moment as he looked down at his hands. Brave, maybe, he said quietly. But war changes you. It leaves scars. Some you can see and some you can't. There was a pause as the weight of his words settled in the air. Sarah felt a pang of sadness for him, knowing that his service had likely come at a great personal cost. She could sense the unspoken memories he carried, memories that still weighed heavily on his heart. Emma, ever curious, asked softly, Did you get hurt in the war, Emma, Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson's eyes softened at her innocence. Yes, I did, he said, pointing to his leg. This limp of mine, got it from a bullet wound in Korea. There's still some shrapnel in there that the doctors couldn't get out. Emma's eyes widened. Wow, does it hurt? Every now and then, Mr. Thompson replied with a small smile. But I'm lucky I made it home. A lot of good men didn't. Sarah's heart ached at the thought. She had always admired veterans, but hearing Mr. Thompson's personal account made the sacrifice feel even more real. She couldn't imagine what he had gone through, but she could sense the deep pain he carried for those he had lost. There was one man, Mr. Thompson continued after a pause, his voice growing quieter. A friend of mine, John. We served together in Korea. He saved my life more times than I can count, but he didn't make it back. I owe him everything. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as Mr. Thompson spoke. The way he said John's name, there was a reverence, a sorrow, that told her this friendship had been more than just comrades in arms. This man had been important to him, and losing him had left a wound that never fully healed. Emma, who had been quietly listening, leaned in closer. What happened to him? Mr. Thompson sighed, his eyes distant as if he were reliving the memory. We were caught in an ambush, bullets flying everywhere. John, he pulled me out of the line of fire, but he was hit. I tried to help him, but he was gone before I could get to him. A silence settled over them, and Sarah could see the tears welling up in Mr. Thompson's eyes. The pain of that day was still fresh for him, even after all these years. I'm so sorry, Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. It must have been incredibly hard. Mr. Thompson nodded, blinking back the tears. It was. Losing him, it was like losing a part of myself. But I carry his memory with me every day. He was a hero. More than that, he was my brother. Sarah felt the sting of tears in her own eyes. The bond between Mr. Thompson and John was palpable, a reminder of the deep connections formed in the most harrowing of circumstances. She couldn't help but think of her own family, her father and grandfather, and the stories they had told her about their own time in the service. But as she listened to Mr. Thompson, something tugged at the back of her mind. A memory, a detail she couldn't quite place. There was something about the way he spoke about John, the way he described him, that felt oddly familiar. Mr. Thompson, Sarah began cautiously, do you have any pictures of John? Mr. Thompson nodded slowly, reaching into the inner pocket of his jacket. His hand trembled slightly as he pulled out an old, worn photograph. He handed it to Sarah, and as she looked down at the image, her heart stopped. The man standing beside Mr. Thompson in the photograph, smiling broadly despite the grim backdrop of war, looked startlingly familiar. Too familiar. Sarah's pulse quickened as she stared at the face of the man in the photo, a face she had seen before, in her own family's albums. Her hands shook as she held the picture. Mr. Thompson, she whispered, her voice barely steady. I think John might be my grandfather. Sarah's heart raced as she stared at the photo in her trembling hands. The man standing beside Mr. Thompson, his arms slung casually around him, looked just like the faded pictures Sarah had seen of her grandfather. Could this be real? Could the man Mr. Thompson was speaking so fondly of, the man who had saved his life, really be her grandfather? Her mind swirled with disbelief, but deep down, something told her that this wasn't just a coincidence. There was no mistaking the face in the photo. Mr. Thompson, noticing her shock, leaned in slightly, his expression filled with concern. Are you all right, miss? Sarah swallowed hard, trying to steady her voice. Mr. Thompson, I think the man in this photo, John, I think he's my grandfather. Mr. Thompson's eyes widened in disbelief. Your grandfather? She nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. I've seen pictures of him before, from my mother's old albums. She used to tell me stories about him, how he served in Korea, how he was a hero, but he never made it back. My mother told me he died in the war, saving others. Mr. Thompson sat back, clearly overwhelmed by the revelation. His hands trembled slightly as he took the photograph back, staring down at it as if seeing it for the first time. John was your grandfather, he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. I don't know what to say. I owe him my life. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of the discovery hanging heavy in the air. Sarah could barely process what she had just uncovered, that this man, who had suffered so much, had been saved by her own grandfather. A man she had never met but had heard so much about. Emma, sensing the significance of the moment, looked up at her mother with wide eyes. Mommy, is that Grandpa John? Sarah nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. Yes, sweetie, that's Grandpa John. Mr. Thompson's gaze softened as he looked between Sarah and Emma. Your grandfather was the bravest man I ever knew, he said quietly. He didn't just save my life, he saved a lot of lives. I've carried the weight of his loss with me all these years, but knowing he was your family, it feels like I've found a piece of him again. Tears spilled down Sarah's cheeks as she listened to Mr. Thompson speak. The pain of losing her grandfather had always been present in her family, a silent sorrow that her mother had carried for years. And now, in the most unexpected way, she had found a connection to him through this man, a man who had survived because of her grandfather's sacrifice. Thank you, Sarah whispered, her voice barely steady. "Thank you for telling me this. I never knew the full story of how he died, but now I do, and it means more to me than you'll ever know." Mr. Thompson nodded, his own eyes glistening with tears. "Your grandfather was a hero, and he lives on through you and your family. I'll never forget him." For the rest of the flight, the three of them sat together, sharing stories and memories. Sarah about her family, Mr. Thompson about his time with John. It felt as if the years of loss and heartache were slowly being healed by the shared connection they had found. But there was still more to the story, something that Mr. Thompson had been holding back. And soon Sarah would learn the full extent of her grandfather's bravery in ways she never could have imagined. The plane continued to hum quietly as Sarah sat beside Mr. Thompson, her mind still reeling from the revelation. The man who had saved Mr. Thompson's life, her grandfather, was a hero she had heard about only through distant memories shared by her mother. But now the connection felt immediate, raw, and emotional. Emma, ever curious, shifted in her seat, still processing everything she had overheard. "Mr. Thompson," she asked softly, "did Grandpa John, did he know he was going to save you?" Mr. Thompson smiled faintly, the wrinkles in his face deepening as he looked at the little girl's innocent face. "He didn't know, sweetheart. In war, there's no time to think about it. You just act on instinct. He knew we were in danger, and he pulled me out of harm's way. But he paid the price for it." Sarah's heart ached at the thought. The idea that her grandfather had made such a split-second decision, sacrificing his own life for someone else's, filled her with both pride and sorrow. She couldn't help but wonder what kind of man he was, beyond the stories her mother had told. The weight of that sacrifice suddenly felt so real, sitting here next to Mr. Thompson, the very man he had saved. "I wish I could have known him," Sarah said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "My mother always spoke of him like he was larger than life, but to me he was just a story." Mr. Thompson nodded, his eyes softening. "John was more than a hero in the war. He was a good man, kind, strong, and always looking out for others. He didn't just fight for his country, he fought for the men beside him. We were like brothers out there. He always had my back." Emma listened carefully, her small face thoughtful as she pieced together the stories of the man who had become larger than life to her too. "Mr. Thompson," she asked after a long pause, "why didn't Grandpa John come home? Why did he have to go?" The question hung in the air for a moment, and Sarah felt the familiar ache in her chest. The same ache she had felt when her mother used to talk about her father's death. How do you explain to a child the complexity of war and sacrifice? Mr. Thompson, however, answered with remarkable gentleness. "Sometimes in life, we have to make choices to protect the people we love. Your grandpa didn't want to leave his family behind, but he wanted to protect them. And sometimes that means going far away to keep them safe. It's a hard thing, but he did it because he loved his family, and he loved his country." Emma nodded slowly, her young mind beginning to grasp the gravity of what Mr. Thompson was saying. "He was really brave," she said, her voice soft and full of admiration. Mr. Thompson's eyes gleamed with tears that he didn't let fall. "He was the bravest man I've ever known." Sarah could hardly speak, overcome by the weight of the moment. She had always known her grandfather had died in the war. But hearing this, hearing how he had saved lives, how he had been a protector in more ways than one, gave her a sense of closure she never realized she needed. "I never knew how he died," Sarah whispered, more to herself than anyone else. "My mother told me he was lost in action, but she didn't know the details." Mr. Thompson turned to her, his voice low and full of emotion. "It wasn't just that he saved me, Sarah. Your grandfather, John, he led us out of that ambush. He fought until the very end, giving every ounce of strength he had to make sure the rest of us survived. Without him, none of us would have made it out alive." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Her grandfather hadn't just been a casualty of war. He had been a leader, a protector, someone who had sacrificed himself for the lives of others. The rest of the plane ride passed in a blur as Sarah and Mr. Thompson continued to talk, sharing stories and memories that bridged the gap between generations. Emma, too, stayed close, her innocent questions bringing out even more stories from Mr. Thompson's time in the war. But it was clear that one story weighed more heavily on him than the others, the story of how John had saved him. As the plane began its descent, Mr. Thompson grew quiet, his gaze distant as if lost in thought. Sarah sensed that he had something more to share, something even deeper than the stories he had already told. And she was right. What he would reveal next would change everything she thought she knew about her grandfather's legacy. As the plane began its descent, the soft hum of the engines filled the cabin. The chatter of passengers making final preparations for landing seemed to fade into the background as Sarah and Mr. Thompson remained deep in conversation. There was something in Mr. Thompson's expression, an unspoken heaviness, as though he had held back a piece of the story that weighed heavily on his heart. Sarah glanced at Emma, who was now preoccupied with her coloring book, her young mind drifting away from the seriousness of the conversation. Sensing the shift in Mr. Thompson's demeanor, Sarah leaned in closer. "Is everything all right, Mr. Thompson?" she asked gently. He sighed, rubbing a hand over his face as if trying to wipe away the burden of years of memories. "There's something I've never told anyone about that day," he said quietly. "Something I've carried with me ever since John saved my life." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She could feel the weight of what was coming, the gravity in his tone. "When John pulled me out of the line of fire, he didn't hesitate. He never hesitated. That was the kind of man he was, always putting others before himself," Mr. Thompson began, his voice filled with reverence. But what most people didn't know was that John was already injured. He had been shot earlier in the ambush, but he didn't let it stop him. Sarah gasped, her eyes wide with shock. "He was already hurt?" Mr. Thompson nodded, his eyes filled with sorrow. "Yes, he had taken a bullet to the shoulder before he even reached me. But he didn't let it slow him down. He pushed through the pain, knowing that if he didn't, more of us would die." Oh. Sarah's throat tightened as she imagined her grandfather, wounded and yet still fighting to save the men around him. The bravery and selflessness he must have shown in those final moments made her heart ache with pride and grief. "He didn't tell anyone he was hurt," Mr. Thompson continued, his voice trembling. "He didn't want anyone to worry about him. He kept going until the very end, making sure we were all safe. It wasn't until after the fighting had stopped that we realized just how badly he had been injured." Tears welled in Sarah's eyes as she listened. Her grandfather hadn't just been a hero, he had been a man who gave everything, even when his own life was on the line. She had always known he had died in the war, but hearing this story, hearing how he had fought through the pain to protect others, filled her with a deep sense of loss and admiration. "He saved me," Mr. Thompson said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "But it cost him his life." Sarah wiped away a tear, her heart breaking for both her grandfather and the man sitting beside her, who had carried the weight of this story for so many years. "I can't imagine how hard it must have been for you," she said gently. Mr. Thompson shook his head, his eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and sorrow. "It's something I've lived with every day. The guilt, the pain, the gratitude. John gave me the chance to live, and I've tried to honor his memory ever since. But I've always wondered if it was enough, if I've done enough to make his sacrifice worthwhile." Sarah placed a hand on his arm, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "You've done more than enough, Mr. Thompson. My grandfather saved you because he believed in what you stood for, and I'm sure he would be proud of the life you've lived." Mr. Thompson nodded, but there was still a hint of sadness in his eyes. "I've tried to live a good life. I've tried to be the man John would have wanted me to be, but I've never had the chance to tell his family, to tell you, how much he meant to me." Tears streamed down Sarah's face as she listened to Mr. Thompson's heartfelt words. "You just did," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "And it means more to me than you'll ever know." For a moment, they sat in silence, the weight of the past heavy between them, but it was a silence filled with understanding, with shared grief, and with a deep sense of connection that transcended time and distance. As the plane touched down on the runway, Sarah felt a sense of closure beginning to settle over her. She had always wondered about her grandfather's story, and now she finally had the answers she had been searching for. But more than that, she had found a living connection to him through Mr. Thompson, a man who had been saved by her grandfather's sacrifice. As the plane taxied to the gate, Mr. Thompson looked over at Sarah, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Thank you, Sarah," he said quietly, "for listening, for letting me tell you about John. It means the world to me." Sarah smiled through her tears, her heart full. "Thank you for sharing his story with me. I never knew the full extent of what he did, but now, thanks to you, I do." As the plane came to a stop and the passengers began to gather their belongings, Sarah knew that this was a moment she would carry with her for the rest of her life, a moment that had brought her closer to her grandfather and to the man he had saved. But there was still one more chapter to this story, and it would unfold in the most unexpected way once they left the plane. As the plane came to a complete stop, the soft click of seatbelts being unfastened echoed through the cabin. Passengers began to shuffle out of their seats, gathering their belongings from the overhead bins and chatting about their upcoming destinations. But for Sarah, Mr. Thompson, and Emma, the moment felt heavier, filled with the weight of the past and the anticipation of what was yet to come. "Mommy, Are we going to see Grandpa John's old pictures at Grandma's house? Emma asked excitedly, tugging on Sarah's sleeve as they stood to gather their things. Sarah smiled, brushing a strand of hair behind her daughter's ear. Yes, sweetie. We'll definitely go through those pictures when we get there. But as she spoke, an idea started to form in her mind. Something more significant than just looking at old photographs. Mr. Thompson, now standing with his cane in hand, gave Sarah a grateful smile as they slowly made their way down the aisle and off the plane. I'm so glad I met you both today, he said. I never imagined I'd have the chance to meet John's family. We're glad we met you too, Sarah replied warmly. It feels like fate, doesn't it? He nodded, his eyes soft with emotion. It truly does. As they exited the plane and made their way through the terminal, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that this reunion with Mr. Thompson was something far bigger than just a chance encounter. There was a deeper connection here, one that needed to be honored. After collecting their luggage, they stood at the entrance of the terminal, the noise of the bustling airport swirling around them. Sarah turned to Mr. Thompson, a thoughtful look in her eyes. Mr. Thompson, where are you headed next? Do you have someone meeting you here? The elderly man shook his head. No, I'm just heading home. I live alone these days. Sarah hesitated for a moment, then decided to act on the thought that had been growing in her mind since the plane ride. Would you like to come with us? To meet my mother and see where John's family grew up? Mr. Thompson's eyes widened in surprise. Are you sure? I don't want to impose. You wouldn't be imposing at all, Sarah said quickly. In fact, I think my mother would love to meet you. She always talks about Grandpa John, and I know it would mean the world to her to hear your stories. Emma, sensing the excitement in her mother's voice, bounced on her heels. Yes, Mr. Thompson. Please come with us. I want to hear more stories about Grandpa John. Mr. Thompson hesitated, looking at Sarah with a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty. I don't want it to be a burden, he said softly. Sarah shook her head. You're not a burden. You're part of this story, part of my grandfather's story, and I think it would bring us all some peace to share this time together. Mr. Thompson smiled, a tear slipping down his cheek. I would be honored, he said quietly. With that decision made, Sarah arranged for a car to take them to her mother's house, a quaint home on the outskirts of the city where Sarah had spent much of her childhood. As they drove through the tree-lined streets, the conversation between Sarah and Mr. Thompson flowed easily, as though they had known each other for years. Emma chimed in with questions, her curious mind always searching for more stories about her brave Grandpa John. When they finally arrived at Sarah's mother's house, the sun was beginning to set, casting a golden hue over the quiet neighborhood. Sarah's heart raced with anticipation as they approached the front door. She knew her mother would be shocked, but also deeply moved by the man standing beside them. As they stepped onto the porch, Sarah turned to Mr. Thompson, giving him a reassuring smile. Ready? He nodded, though there was a hint of nervousness in his expression. Sarah knocked on the door, and within moments, it swung open to reveal her mother, a woman in her early 60s with kind eyes and a warm smile. Sarah, she exclaimed, pulling her daughter into a tight hug. And Emma, my sweet girl. But then her eyes fell on Mr. Thompson, and her expression shifted from joy to confusion. Who's this? Sarah took a deep breath, glancing at Mr. Thompson before turning back to her mother. Mom, this is James Thompson. He served with Grandpa John in Korea. He was there when Grandpa died. Her mother's eyes widened, her hand covering her mouth as tears welled up in her eyes. You knew my father? Mr. Thompson nodded, his voice thick with emotion. Yes, ma'am. Your father saved my life. Sarah's mother stared at him for a moment, speechless. Then, without another word, she stepped forward and embraced him, her body shaking with sobs. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you for keeping his memory alive. Mr. Thompson hugged her back, his own tears falling freely. He was a hero, ma'am, and he's never left my heart. For the next several hours, they sat together in the living room, sharing stories and memories of John. Sarah's mother brought out old photo albums, and Mr. Thompson pointed out the faces of the men he had served with, including her grandfather. There was laughter, tears, and a deep sense of healing as the past came to life through the stories they shared. As the night wore on, Sarah felt an overwhelming sense of peace. Her grandfather's legacy was no longer just a distant memory. It was alive in the hearts of those who had known and loved him. And through this unexpected reunion with Mr. Thompson, they had found a way to honor his sacrifice and keep his memory alive for generations to come. The living room was filled with warmth, the gentle glow of lamps casting a soft light over the group as they continued to share stories late into the evening. Mr. Thompson's voice grew quieter as the night went on, but the intensity of his emotions never waned. Sarah, her mother, and even young Emma listened intently, each of them piecing together a fuller picture of John. the man they had heard about their entire lives, but were now truly getting to know through Mr. Thompson's eyes. Your father, Mr. Thompson said, turning to Sarah's mother, was a man of few words, but when he spoke, everyone listened. He had this way about him. Even when things got rough, he made us all feel like we could get through anything. Sarah's mother wiped away a tear, smiling as she held the old photograph of her father that Mr. Thompson had shown them on the plane. My mother always said he was like that too, she said softly. Calm and steady, no matter what. She missed him every day after he left for the war. Mr. Thompson nodded, his gaze distant as he recalled those days. We all missed him, he said. Even now, I miss him. But seeing you all today, it feels like he's still with us. Emma, who had been listening quietly while nestled into Sarah's side, piped up with a thoughtful question. Mr. Thompson, do you think Grandpa John would be proud of you? The room went silent for a moment as Mr. Thompson's face softened, the weight of Emma's question hanging in the air. His eyes glistened with unshed tears, and he leaned forward slightly, his voice tender. I'd like to think he would be, sweetheart. I've tried to live my life in a way that would honor his memory. He gave me a second chance at life, and I've spent every day since trying to be the kind of man he'd be proud to call his friend. Emma's brow furrowed in concentration as she thought about that, her young mind grasping the importance of what Mr. Thompson had said. I think he'd be proud of you, she said with a firm nod, as if her approval was all that mattered. Mr. Thompson chuckled, his heart warmed by the little girl's innocent yet profound words. Thank you, Emma. That means more to me than you know. Sarah's mother stood up and left the room briefly, returning with an old military medal in her hand. She approached Mr. Thompson, holding it out to him with a shaky smile. This belonged to my father. It was awarded to him posthumously for his bravery in the war. My mother kept it safe all these years, and now I think you should have it. Mr. Thompson's eyes widened in disbelief, and he shook his head as he backed away slightly. I couldn't possibly take this, he said, his voice trembling. That medal belongs with his family. But Sarah's mother insisted, pressing the medal into his hands. You are part of his family. You've carried his memory with you for all these years. This is yours as much as it is ours. Tears streamed down Mr. Thompson's face as he held the medal in his hands, his fingers trembling as he traced the engraved letters. I don't know what to say, he whispered, overcome with emotion. Thank you. This means the world to me. The room was quiet for a long moment as everyone processed the significance of what had just happened. Sarah's heart swelled with pride and love for her grandfather, for Mr. Thompson, and for the unbreakable bond that had been formed between them all. Grandpa John was a hero, Emma said softly, her eyes wide with admiration. He saved people, just like in the stories. Sarah hugged her daughter tightly, her voice thick with emotion as she replied, Yes, sweetie, he was a hero, and so is Mr. Thompson. Mr. Thompson smiled at Emma, his heart full as he held the medal close to his chest. Your grandfather was a hero, he said softly, and I will carry his memory with me, always. As the evening wore on, they all sat together, talking about their lives, their families, and the incredible journey that had brought them to this moment. It felt as though they had known each other forever, bound together by the shared history of a man who had given his life for the people he loved. But more than that, it felt like they were healing from the loss of John, from the years of wondering and wishing they could have known him better. Now, through Mr. Thompson's stories, they had come to know the man behind the hero, the man who had been brave, kind, and selfless. And as they all sat together in that living room, Sarah realized that this was more than just a reunion. This was a celebration of life, of legacy, and of the enduring power of love and sacrifice. The next morning brought a sense of calm and renewal. The previous night had been filled with so much emotion that it was hard to imagine what could come next. As the sunlight filtered through the windows, illuminating the old photographs and the cherished medal now resting on the mantel, Sarah felt a quiet peace settling in. Mr. Thompson had stayed overnight at her mother's insistence, and now, as the house slowly woke up, there was a feeling of togetherness that hung in the air. Sarah made her way downstairs to find him sitting at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee in hand, staring out the window at the quiet, tree-lined street. Good morning, she said softly, taking a seat across from him. Mr. Thompson looked up, his eyes tired but warm. Good morning, Sarah, he replied. Thank you again for everything. I can't tell you what this has meant to me. Sarah smiled, feeling the weight of the previous night's conversation still lingering between them. I think we all needed this, she said. It's given me a sense of closure I didn't even know I was looking for. Mr. Thompson nodded, his gaze drifting back to the window. Your grandfather gave me something no one else could have. a second chance at life, and I've tried to live in a way that would honor him every day. Sarah leaned forward slightly, sensing that there was more to his words. What do you mean? Mr. Thompson took a deep breath, his fingers tapping lightly on the edge of the coffee cup. After the war, I struggled a lot. It's hard to come back from something like that and just go back to living a normal life. I had a hard time finding my place in the world, but I kept thinking about John, about what he would have done if he'd made it home. I felt like I had to live not just for myself, but for him too. Sarah felt a lump form in her throat as she listened. She had always wondered how veterans like her grandfather had managed to find their way after such trauma, and hearing Mr. Thompson's story made her realize just how difficult that journey must have been. So I decided to dedicate my life to helping others, Mr. Thompson continued, his voice growing stronger. I became a teacher, and later, I started a program for veterans who were struggling to adjust after the war. I wanted to make sure that no one felt as lost as I did when I first came home. Sarah's eyes widened in surprise. You did all that? Mr. Thompson nodded, a small smile forming on his lips. I had to do something. I couldn't let John's sacrifice go to waste. He gave me the chance to live, and I wanted to make sure that chance was worth something. Sarah felt a swell of admiration for the man sitting across from her. You've done more than enough, Mr. Thompson, she said, her voice thick with emotion. You've honored him in the best way possible. Mr. Thompson looked down at his coffee, a quiet smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. I like to think so, but meeting you and your family, it feels like the final piece of the puzzle. I've spent all these years carrying John's memory with me, and now I can finally share it with the people who matter most. Tears welled in Sarah's eyes, but she blinked them back, overwhelmed by the depth of his words. I'm so glad you found us, she whispered. I feel like we've found a piece of ourselves that was missing all this time. Just then, the sound of small footsteps interrupted the quiet conversation. Emma bounded into the kitchen, her hair tousled from sleep, and she immediately climbed onto Sarah's lap, her wide eyes settling on Mr. Thompson. Good morning, Mr. Thompson, she said cheerfully. Are we going to hear more stories about Grandpa John today? Mr. Thompson chuckled, his heart warmed by the little girl's enthusiasm. If you'd like, I'd be happy to tell you more, he said, his eyes twinkling with affection. Emma nodded eagerly, her excitement bubbling over. Yes, please. I want to know all about him. Sarah smiled as she watched the interaction between her daughter and Mr. Thompson. It was as if their family had gained a new member overnight, someone who not only shared their past, but was helping to shape their future. For the rest of the morning, they sat around the kitchen table, Mr. Thompson sharing stories about the war, about John, and about the life he had built after returning home. Emma listened intently, her eyes wide with wonder, while Sarah and her mother soaked in every word, cherishing this unexpected connection to the man they had lost so many years ago. As the day wore on, Sarah felt a sense of completeness that she hadn't experienced before. The pieces of her family's story were coming together in a way she had never imagined, and it all started with one small act of kindness on a plane. And yet, as full as her heart was, she knew that the journey wasn't over. There was still more to uncover, still more to share. And as she looked at Mr. Thompson, she realized that this wasn't just about honoring the past. It was about building something new, something lasting, for the future. The morning sun streamed through the windows, casting a warm glow on the kitchen table where Sarah, Emma, Mr. Thompson, and Sarah's mother sat together, sharing breakfast. The atmosphere was light, filled with the kind of easy conversation that only comes after a deeply emotional and healing experience. Mr. Thompson had been telling stories of his years after the war, how he had navigated the ups and downs of life with the weight of John's memory always on his shoulders. He spoke of his work helping other veterans and how much it had meant to him to give back, to make sure that no one who came home felt as lost as he had once felt. I think he would have been proud of you, Sarah's mother said, her voice soft but firm. You've honored his legacy in ways we never could have imagined. Mr. Thompson smiled, but there was a lingering sadness in his eyes. I hope so, he replied. It's always been my goal to live a life that would make John proud. He gave me that chance, and I didn't want to waste it. Emma, who had been listening carefully, tilted her head thoughtfully. Mr. Thompson, will you tell people about Grandpa John, so they know how brave he was? The question hung in the air, and Sarah felt her chest tighten. Emma's innocent words carried a weight that went far beyond her years. How could they make sure John's story, his bravery, his sacrifice, wasn't forgotten? Mr. Thompson looked at Emma with a gentle smile. I will, sweetheart, he said softly. I'll tell as many people as I can, but it's not just my job anymore. It's up to all of us to keep his memory alive. Sarah's mother nodded, her eyes misty as she looked at the picture of John resting on the kitchen counter. We'll make sure his story is never forgotten, she said quietly. We'll make sure future generations know who he was and what he did. A sense of resolve settled over the room. It wasn't just about honoring the past. It was about making sure that John's sacrifice, and the sacrifices of all the brave men and women like him, would be remembered. They wouldn't let his memory fade into history. They would carry it forward, teaching their children and grandchildren about the heroism and the humanity that defined his life. I think that's what he would have wanted, Sarah said softly. Not just to be remembered as a soldier, but as a man who cared about others, a man who made a difference. Mr. Thompson nodded, his expression somber but peaceful. That's exactly who he was, he said. He didn't fight because he loved war. He fought because he loved people, his family, his friends, his country. That's the John I knew. That's the man I'll always remember. Sarah felt a wave of emotion wash over her, and she reached for Emma's hand, squeezing it gently. We're going to make sure that people know his story, she said firmly. And not just his story, your story too, Mr. Thompson. You're part of this, and we want to honor you as well. Mr. Thompson looked surprised, but a soft smile crossed his face. I don't need any honors, Sarah. Just knowing that I've kept John's memory alive is enough for me. But Sarah shook her head, her voice filled with determination. No, you've done more than that. You've carried his legacy for all these years, and now we want to help carry yours. You deserve to be recognized for everything you've done, for the life you've lived, for the people you've helped. Her mother nodded in agreement, and even Emma gave a firm, enthusiastic nod of her own. You're a hero too, Mr. Thompson, Emma said. You're like Grandpa John. You saved people. Mr. Thompson chuckled softly, his eyes glistening with tears. You all are too kind, he said quietly. But if I can be remembered for anything, I hope it's for trying to live a good life, a life that honored the man who saved me. And you have, Sarah's mother said gently. You've done more than enough. And now we're going to make sure your story is remembered too. As the conversation continued, an idea began to take shape in Sarah's mind. An idea that felt like the perfect way to honor both John and Mr. Thompson. She hadn't thought about it before, but now it seemed so clear, so right. Mr. Thompson, she said suddenly, what would you think about sharing these stories with a wider audience? I mean, beyond just us. What if we found a way to tell the world about you and Grandpa John? Mr. Thompson blinked, clearly taken aback by the suggestion. The world? He repeated, his voice uncertain. What do you mean? I mean, Sarah continued, her mind racing with the possibilities. We could tell your story, the story of how you met, how you served together, and how Grandpa John saved your life. We could share it with people who need to hear it, people who don't know what you both went through. Mr. Thompson looked thoughtful, his fingers tracing the edge of the coffee cup. I never thought about telling the story like that, he said slowly, but maybe it's time. Maybe people need to know. Sarah's mother nodded in agreement, her expression soft but resolute. It's a story that needs to be told, not just for us, but for future generations. Emma clapped her hands excitedly. Yes, everyone should know about Grandpa John and Mr. Thompson. It's a real hero story. A quiet smile spread across Mr. Thompson's face as he looked at the eager faces around him. All right, he said softly. If that's what you all want, then I'm in. Let's tell the story. And with that, they made a promise to each other. A promise to share the legacy of John and Mr. Thompson with the world, to make sure that their bravery and their friendship would be remembered for generations to come. The promise to share John and Mr. Thompson's story filled the room with a new energy. It was as though a weight had been lifted, replaced with a sense of purpose. Sarah, her mother, and Emma all felt a deep responsibility, not just to honor the memory of their beloved grandfather, but to make sure that the world knew about the lives he had touched, especially Mr. Thompson's. After breakfast, they gathered in the living room, surrounded by old photographs, military memorabilia, and the stories that had been passed down through generations. Mr. Thompson sat quietly for a moment, as if contemplating the enormity of the task ahead. I never thought my life would be something worth sharing with the world, he said softly, his hands resting on his cane. But maybe this is exactly what John would have wanted. Sarah leaned forward, her heart full of warmth and determination. This isn't just about the past, Mr. Thompson. It's about the future. It's about showing people what true bravery and sacrifice look like, so that they can carry those values forward. Her mother nodded in agreement, holding one of the photographs of John from the war. We need to make sure people remember, not just what they see in history books, but the real stories behind the faces. Emma, ever eager to be part of the conversation, tugged on Mr. Thompson's sleeve. Can we tell people all about how you and Grandpa John were best friends? How you saved each other? Mr. Thompson smiled warmly at her. Yes, we can tell them that, and much more. With that decision made, they spent the next few hours brainstorming how they could bring their story to life. Sarah, who had always had an eye for writing and storytelling, took the lead, suggesting that they start by creating a memoir, a book that could capture the essence of their journey together. It would be more than just a recounting of battles and loss. It would be a tribute to the bond between two men who had faced impossible odds together. Mr. Thompson, though a bit hesitant at first, slowly began to open up as Sarah and her mother asked him more about his life. The conversation moved from the war to his early years growing up, to the friends he had made and lost along the way, and to the deep bond he had shared with John. There's so much more to tell, Mr. Thompson said at one point, his voice filled with emotion. John was more than a soldier. He was a man of integrity, compassion, and heart. And I want people to know that side of him. We will, Sarah promised. We'll make sure the world knows who he was, who both of you were. As the afternoon sun filtered through the windows, Sarah began typing notes on her laptop, capturing Mr. Thompson's stories and weaving them into a narrative that would eventually become their shared memoir. Her mother helped with details, sharing what she knew from family stories, and even Emma contributed, offering her own perspective on what it meant to learn about her great-grandfather. It was a true collaboration, one that brought them all closer together. And as the hours passed, Mr. Thompson seemed to grow lighter, as if the act of sharing his story had given him a new sense of purpose. He smiled more often, his eyes sparkling as he reminisced about the days spent with John, the adventures they had, and the lessons they had learned. At one point, Sarah paused, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. Mr. Thompson, do you remember the last conversation you had with my grandfather before the ambush? Mr. Thompson's face softened, and he nodded slowly. I do. It's something I've never forgotten. We were sitting by the fire, talking about what we would do when the war was over. John said he wanted to go home and see his family, that all he wanted was to hold his little girl again. Sarah's heart clenched. That little girl was my mother, she whispered. Mr. Thompson's eyes misted over. I know. He talked about her all the time. He loved you so much, he said, turning to Sarah's mother, who sat beside him, tears in her eyes. All he wanted was to make the world a better place for you. Her mother, overcome with emotion, nodded silently. The weight of her father's sacrifice felt heavier now, but it was also filled with a sense of pride. Pride in the man he was and the choices he had made. I never knew how much he wanted to come home, her mother said softly, her voice trembling. I always wondered if he knew how much we loved him. He knew, Mr. Thompson replied firmly. He knew, and he carried that love with him every day. The room fell silent as they all absorbed the magnitude of Mr. Thompson's words. There was something profoundly healing about hearing the truth after all these years, something that allowed them to move forward, not just in remembrance, but in celebration of the life John had lived. Later that evening, as they sat around the dinner table, Sarah looked around at her family and Mr. Thompson and felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. They had come together through an unexpected twist of fate, but it had given them something priceless, a renewed connection to their past and a shared mission for the future. This is just the beginning, Sarah said, her voice filled with hope. We're going to tell this story, and we're going to make sure it's heard by as many people as possible. Mr. Thompson smiled, his heart full. I'm ready, he said quietly. Let's make sure they know who John was. And with that, they made a vow to share their story, to carry John's legacy forward, and to honor the sacrifices of all those who had come before them. It wasn't just about remembering the past. It was about building a future where those stories would inspire generations to come. The days that followed were filled with planning and excitement. The decision to share John's story with the world had sparked something in all of them, giving them a renewed sense of purpose. Sarah worked tirelessly on the memoir, carefully crafting the words that would bring John and Mr. Thompson's experiences to life. Every story shared by Mr. Thompson painted a vivid picture of the courage, friendship, and sacrifice that defined both men's lives. Sarah's mother continued to unearth more family memorabilia, piecing together old letters, medals, and keepsakes from John's time in the service. Each item told a story, and with every discovery, their mission to honor John's memory grew stronger. For Mr. Thompson, the act of telling his story was both cathartic and overwhelming. He had spent so many years keeping these memories to himself, unsure if anyone would ever care to hear them. But now he saw how much John's family cherished every word, how much they longed to know more about the man they had lost, but had never truly forgotten. One afternoon, as Sarah worked on the memoir, Mr. Thompson sat beside her, watching as she typed. He had been quiet for a while, lost in thought, but eventually, he spoke up. "You know, Sarah," he began, his voice soft, "I never expected to find a family like this. For years, I've carried John's memory with me, but I've always felt alone in it. Meeting you all, it's given me a sense of peace I didn't know I needed." Sarah paused, turning to face him. "We feel the same way, Mr. Thompson. You've given us something we never thought we'd have, a real connection to my grandfather. You've helped us understand him in ways we never could have before." Mr. Thompson smiled, though there was a hint of sadness in his eyes. "I wish I could have done more. I wish I could have brought him home." Sarah reached out, placing a comforting hand on his arm. "You did more than enough. You've carried his legacy with you all these years, and now, together, we're making sure the world knows who he was." The memoir was taking shape beautifully. Sarah's writing brought John's bravery to life, and Mr. Thompson's first-hand accounts added a richness and authenticity that made the story even more powerful. Each chapter was a tribute, not only to the sacrifices made by John, but also to the enduring bonds of friendship and loyalty that had shaped Mr. Thompson's life. As they worked, word of their project began to spread. Sarah's friends and colleagues became interested in the story, and soon the local community got involved. A journalist from a nearby town heard about their memoir and reached out, eager to help them share John and Mr. Thompson's story on a larger scale. "I think people need to hear this," the journalist had said during a phone call with Sarah. "There's so much division in the world right now, but stories like this, stories about sacrifice, friendship, and honor, can remind people of what really matters." Sarah agreed wholeheartedly. The world needed more stories like John's, and she was determined to make sure his legacy reached as many people as possible. The family gathered one evening to discuss the next steps. They sat around the living room, the walls adorned with photographs of John, as they talked about how to bring the story to life beyond the pages of a book. Sarah's mother suggested holding a special event in their community, a memorial to honor John and other veterans who had served with him. "It could be a way to give back," her mother said, "a way to make sure people know who these men were and what they sacrificed for us." Mr. Thompson's eyes lit up at the idea. "That sounds like a wonderful way to honor John," he said. "A memorial would keep his memory alive for future generations, and it would give other families a chance to honor their loved ones too." The idea quickly gained traction. They began planning a community event that would feature a tribute to John and Mr. Thompson, along with a display of the memorabilia and stories they had collected over the past few weeks. Veterans from the area were invited to share their own stories, and soon the event grew into something much bigger than they had initially imagined. As the event approached, the excitement was palpable. Flyers were distributed throughout the town, local businesses offered to help sponsor the memorial, and even the local school arranged for students to attend, ensuring that the younger generation would learn about the sacrifices made by men like John and Mr. Thompson. The night before the event, Sarah sat with Mr. Thompson on the front porch, looking out at the quiet street. The air was cool, and a sense of peace settled over them as they reflected on everything that had happened. "You've given me something I never thought I'd have," Mr. Thompson said quietly, his gaze distant. "You've given me a family, a place where I belong." Sarah smiled, her heart full. "We're the lucky ones, Mr. Thompson. You've given us so much more than we could ever repay." Mr. Thompson shook his head. "No, Sarah, it's the other way around. You've given me a chance to make sure John's story doesn't die with me. That's the greatest gift I could have ever asked for." As they sat in silence for a few moments, Sarah felt a deep sense of fulfillment wash over her. The story they had worked so hard to tell was finally being shared with the world. And not only were they honoring John's memory, but they were also celebrating the life of a man who had carried that memory for so long, Mr. Thompson. The next day would be a day of remembrance, of healing, and of hope. It was a chance to remind everyone, young and old, of the values that mattered most: sacrifice, friendship, and love. And as Sarah looked at Mr. Thompson, she knew that John's legacy was in good hands. Together, they would ensure that it lived on forever. The day of the memorial arrived with a sense of anticipation and purpose. The community center was filled with people, friends, family, veterans, and those who had simply heard about the story of John and Mr. Thompson. The atmosphere buzzed with excitement, but there was also a quiet reverence in the air, as everyone knew this was more than just an event. It was a tribute to the past, a reminder of the sacrifices made, and a celebration of the bonds that endured even after the hardest of times. Sarah, her mother, and Emma stood together near the entrance, greeting guests as they arrived. Mr. Thompson, dressed in his finest suit, stood beside them, shaking hands with old friends and neighbors who had come to honor his story, and John's. The walls of the center were lined with photographs from John's time in the service, alongside pictures of Mr. Thompson and other veterans who had served with him. A special display featured John's medals, letters, and the photographs Mr. Thompson had carried with him all these years, telling the story of their friendship and the sacrifice that had defined their bond. As people gathered in the main hall, Sarah could see the impact the story was having. She overheard conversations, people marveling at the bravery of the men who had served, parents explaining the significance of the memorial to their children, veterans quietly reflecting on their own experiences. Emma, excited as ever, tugged on Mr. Thompson's sleeve. "Mr. Thompson, are you going to tell the story of how Grandpa John saved you?" Mr. Thompson smiled warmly, his heart touched by the little girl's enthusiasm. "Yes, Emma, I'll be telling that story today." The event began with a few words from the local Veterans Association, who spoke about the importance of remembering those who had served. Then it was Mr. Thompson's turn to take the stage. Sarah and her mother sat in the front row, Emma on Sarah's lap, as Mr. Thompson stood before the crowd. He looked out over the sea of faces, pausing for a moment as if gathering his thoughts. Then, with a deep breath, he began to speak. "Thank you all for being here today," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I never imagined that I'd be standing here, sharing this story with so many people. But today isn't just about me. It's about John. John was my best friend, my brother in arms, and the man who saved my life. And today, I'm here to make sure his story is remembered." He paused, his gaze softening as he looked at Sarah and her mother. John was more than just a soldier. He was a father, a husband, and a man who cared deeply about the people around him. When we were in Korea, he was the one who kept us all going. He was the one who gave us hope. Mr. Thompson's voice wavered slightly, but he continued, his words filled with reverence. "John sacrificed everything to make sure that I and the others made it home. He gave his life for me, and I've carried that with me every day since. I've tried to live my life in a way that would make him proud. But today, I realize that his story isn't just mine to carry. It belongs to all of us." He turned to Sarah and her mother, his eyes glistening with tears. "To John's family, I want to say thank you. Thank you for sharing this journey with me. Thank you for letting me be a part of your lives. And thank you for allowing me to honor the man who meant so much to all of us." Sarah wiped away a tear as she listened, her heart full of pride and love. This was the moment she had been waiting for. The moment when John's legacy, carried by Mr. Thompson for so many years, would be passed on to everyone in the room. Mr. Thompson continued, his voice growing stronger. "John's story is one of courage, of sacrifice, and of friendship. It's a story that should remind us all of what truly matters in this world, taking care of one another, standing up for what's right, and living a life filled with love and purpose." The audience was silent, hanging on every word. The gravity of Mr. Thompson's words resonated deeply, touching every heart in the room. "And now," Mr. Thompson said, his voice softening, "it's up to all of us to carry that story forward, to make sure that future generations know about the sacrifices made by men like John, and to live in a way that honors those sacrifices." He looked out over the crowd, his heart full. "Thank you for listening, and thank you for helping me keep John's memory alive." The room erupted in applause, but it wasn't the kind of applause one might hear at a performance. It was a slow, steady wave of appreciation, a tribute to the man who had given so much, and to the friend who had carried his story all these years. As Mr. Thompson stepped down from the stage, Sarah and her family embraced him, their hearts overflowing with gratitude. "You did it," Sarah whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You told his story." Mr. Thompson nodded, his eyes filled with peace. "We all did, together." The rest of the event was a beautiful celebration of life and legacy. Veterans shared their stories, families reflected on the importance of remembering those who had served, and the community came together to honor not just John, but all the men and women who had sacrificed for the greater good. As the day came to a close, Sarah stood with Mr. Thompson and her family, watching as people filtered out of the center, many of them stopping to offer their thanks or share their own memories. It was a day none of them would ever forget, a day that had brought them closer together and ensured that John's story would live on. As they prepared to leave, Emma tugged on Mr. Thompson's hand one last time. "Mr. Thompson, I'll tell people about Grandpa John, too," she said earnestly. "I promise." Mr. Thompson smiled, his heart full as he knelt down to her level. "That's all I could ever ask for, Emma. Thank you." Sarah watched as Emma hugged Mr. Thompson tightly, her young heart already carrying the weight of her family's history. It was a moment that brought everything full circle, a reminder that the stories of the past would continue to shape the future, passed down from one generation to the next. And as they all left the center, walking together into the warm evening air, Sarah knew that John's legacy, his bravery, his sacrifice, his love, would never be forgotten.